when Margaret Holloway receives nothing but a barren strip of land as her inheritance, while her late husband's family takes everything else. She is left with dust, silence, and the weight of a life she no longer recognizes. But beneath the cracked earth and tangled weeds lies something no one expected, something that will unravel secrets buried for decades, challenge everything she believed about her marriage, and force her to confront the woman she was always meant to become. This is not just a story about land. This is a story about what we bury, what we unearth, and what rises when we finally stop running from the truth. If you're ready for a story that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to witness will change the way you see everything. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the door like a whisper meant to go unnoticed. Margaret Holloway had been awake for hours by then, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The house was silent in the way only empty houses can be, not peaceful, but hollow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She had learned to live in that silence. She had learned to fill it with the small rituals of survival, the folding of towels that no one would use, the watering of plants that no one would see, the careful arrangement of her face into something that resembled composure whenever the world demanded it. But the envelope changed everything. It was thin, official, bearing the letterhead of a law firm she did not recognize. Her name was typed across the front, in cold, impersonal letters. Margaret Holloway. Not Mrs. Holloway. Not the widow. Just her name, stripped bare. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she carried it to the window and held it up to the light, as if she could divine its contents through sheer force of will. Outside, the morning was gray and uncertain, the kind of day that could not decide whether to rain or simply brood. The street beyond her window was empty, lined with houses that looked just like hers, neat, modest, forgettable. She had lived here for 32 years. She had raised no children here. She had loved a man here, or thought she had. And when he died, she had stayed, because she did not know where else to go. The envelope trembled slightly in her hands, though she could not say whether it was from fear or anticipation. There was a difference, she had come to understand, between the two. Fear was the certainty of loss. Anticipation was the possibility of change. She was not sure which one she felt more acutely. When she finally tore it open, the words inside were brief and brutal in their efficiency. The estate of her late husband, Henry Holloway, had been settled. His family, his brother, his sister, their children, had received the house in the country, the investments, the savings account she had never been allowed to touch. And Margaret had been given a plot of land, 2 acres of it, to be precise, located on the outskirts of a town she had never heard of, in a county she had visited only once, decades ago, for a funeral she could no longer remember. The letter described it as undeveloped property and of minimal commercial value. There was no apology, no explanation, just the coordinates, the deed, and a phone number to call if she had questions. She did not call. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the table beside her cold tea. Then she sat very still and tried to remember the last time Henry had looked at her with anything other than distraction. The rain began an hour later, a slow, insistent drizzle that blurred the world beyond the glass. Margaret watched it fall and thought about the land she had been given. She tried to picture it, 2 acres of nothing, somewhere far away, a place no one wanted. It felt, in a way, like the perfect metaphor for her life. She had been given the scraps, the leftovers, the thing everyone else had discarded. And yet, as she sat there in silence, something unfamiliar began to stir in the hollow of her chest. It was not anger, though anger would have been easier. It was something quieter, more dangerous. It was curiosity. It was the smallest, most fragile seed of defiance. Because if they had given her this land thinking she would sell it, forget it, disappear quietly into the margins of their family history. Then perhaps, just perhaps, she would do the opposite. Perhaps she would go there. Perhaps she would see for herself what they had deemed worthless. And so, 3 days later, with a single suitcase in the trunk of her aging sedan and a hand-drawn map she had printed from an obscure county website, Margaret Holloway drove toward the place that was supposed to mean nothing. She did not tell anyone where she was going. She did not leave a note. She simply locked the door behind her, left the key and a map for the neighbor who had always been kind but never curious, and pointed her car toward a horizon she could not yet see. The road stretched out before her, long and winding, cutting through farmland and forest, past towns that rose and fell like breaths. She drove with the windows down, letting the wind tangle her hair, letting the sound of the tires on asphalt drown out the voice in her head that kept asking what she was doing, what she hoped to find. She did not have an answer. She only knew that for the first time in years, she was moving toward something instead of away. And that, she thought, was enough. The town of Millbrook appeared on the map as a single grade, unremarkable and easy to miss. Margaret arrived just as the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. The main street was a single strip of asphalt lined with buildings that looked as though they had been standing since before memory, a general store with a faded awning, a diner with a neon sign that buzzed intermittently, a post office with an American flag hanging limp in the still air. There were no people on the street, no cars, just a sense of a place that had been left behind by time, or perhaps had chosen to be. She pulled into the parking lot of the diner and sat for a moment, her hand still gripping the steering wheel, her heart beating with a rhythm that felt unfamiliar. Not quite fear, not quite excitement, but something in between. She had driven for 8 hours. She was tired. She was hungry. But more than that, she was here, and the weight of that simple fact pressed against her chest like a stone. Inside the diner, the air smelled of coffee and fried onions. A woman behind the counter looked up as Margaret entered, her expression neutral but watchful. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with graying hair pulled back in a loose bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything in return. Margaret offered a tentative smile and slid onto one of the vinyl-covered stools at the counter. The woman approached with a pot of coffee in one hand and a laminated menu in the other. She set both down without a word, then stood waiting, her expression unchanged. Margaret ordered a sandwich and a cup of soup, more out of habit than hunger. The woman nodded, scribbled something on a pad, and disappeared into the kitchen. Margaret was alone again. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and let the warmth seep into her palms. Through the window, she could see the sky deepening into shades of violet and indigo, the last light of day retreating beyond the hills. She thought about the land. 2 acres, undeveloped, of minimal commercial value. She still had not seen it. She had driven all this way and had not yet allowed herself to imagine what she might find. When the food arrived, the woman lingered for a moment, her gaze settling on Margaret with something that might have been curiosity or might have been suspicion. "You passing through?" she asked, her voice low and even. Margaret hesitated. She had not expected conversation. She had not prepared for questions. "I'm here to see some land," she said finally, "just outside town. A plot I inherited." The woman's expression shifted, though it was difficult to say exactly how. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and her mouth pressed into a thin line. "Inherited," she repeated, as though the word itself carried weight. "From who?" Margaret told her. She spoke Henry's name, though it felt strange in her mouth, as though it belonged to someone else. The woman nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Holloway," she said softly. "I remember that name." She did not elaborate. She simply refilled Margaret's coffee and walked away, leaving Margaret alone with her soup and the growing sense that she had stepped into something she did not yet understand. She spent the night in a small motel on the edge of town, a place with peeling paint and a flickering vacancy sign. The room was clean but sparse, the kind of space designed for people who did not intend to stay. Margaret lay awake on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of trucks passing on the highway beyond the window. She thought about the woman in the diner, the way her expression had changed when she heard Henry's name. She thought about the land, waiting for her in the darkness just beyond the town's edge. She thought about the life she had left behind, the house with its silent rooms, the neighbors who had never asked where she was going. And she thought about the question she had been avoiding since the moment she opened that envelope. What if the land was not worthless? What if it was something more? The thought terrified her, because if it was something more, then she would have to decide what to do with it. And if it was nothing, then she would have to accept that even in death, Henry had given her only emptiness. The next morning, she drove. The directions were vague, a series of turns onto roads that became progressively narrower, less maintained, until finally she was driving on a dirt path that wound through dense forest, the trees pressing on either side, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns. The air was cooler here, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of tires on gravel and the occasional call of a bird she could not name. She drove slowly, carefully, her hands tight on the wheel, her eyes scanning the roadside for the landmarks the map had promised: a rusted mailbox, a lightning-scarred oak, a stone marker half hidden in the underbrush. She found them, one by one, like breadcrumbs leading her deeper into the forest. And then, suddenly, the trees parted and she was there. The land stretched out before her, a wide, open expanse that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. It was not what she had expected. She had imagined barren soil, cracked and dry, a wasteland of dust and weeds. But this was something else entirely. The ground was uneven, rolling gently in places and dropping sharply in others, covered in wild grasses that swayed in the breeze. There were trees scattered across the property, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches reaching toward the sky like supplicants. And beyond the trees, at the far edge of the land, there was a structure, something low and dark, half hidden by overgrowth, barely visible from where she stood. Margaret turned off the engine and sat in the sudden silence. Her breath came shallow and quick. Her hands trembled. She did not know why. She had driven all this way to see this place. And now that she was here, she felt something she could not name. It was not relief. It was not disappointment. It was something older, something primal. It was a sensation of standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, of feeling the ground shift beneath her feet, even though she had not yet moved. She got out of the car slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile stillness. The air was cooler here than had been in town, and it carried a scent she could not quite place. Earth and rain, and something green and growing. She walked forward, her shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground. The grass brushed against her legs, whispering secrets she could not understand. She moved toward the structure at the edge of property, her heart pounding in her chest. As she drew closer, she could see that it was not a building, not exactly. It was a foundation, old stone walls, crumbling in places, covered in moss and ivy, the remnants of something that had once stood here, something that had been forgotten. She knelt beside one of the walls and ran her fingers over the rough stone. It was cold to the touch, ancient. She could feel the weight of years pressing down on it, the stories it had witnessed and could no longer tell. And then she saw it, carved into the stone, faint but unmistakable, were initials, M.H. and H.H. Margaret and Henry Holloway. Her breath caught in her throat. She traced the letters with her fingertips, feeling the grooves worn smooth by time. She had never been here. She was certain of that. She would have remembered. And yet, here were their initials, carved into stone, claiming this place as theirs. Or perhaps claiming her as part of something she had never known existed. She stood, her legs unsteady, and looked around the property with new eyes. The land was not empty. It was not forgotten. It was waiting. And suddenly, she understood why Henry's family had given it to her. Not because it was worthless, but because they did not want it. Because whatever secrets this place held, they belonged to her alone. Margaret returned to the motel that night with more questions than answers. She lay in a narrow bed, her mind racing, replaying the moment she had seen those initials carved into the stone. MH and HH. She had never known Henry to be sentimental. He had not been the kind of man to carve declarations into trees or write love letters. He had been practical, methodical, a man who measured his life in spreadsheets and schedules. And yet, there was evidence of something she had not known, a piece of his past that had been hidden from her. Or perhaps, she thought with a pang of something that felt like grief, a piece of himself he had tried to forget. She wondered when he had been there. She wondered who he had been with. The initials could have been hers, but she knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that they were not. MH was someone else. Someone who had stood on that land with Henry and carved a promise into stone. Someone who had been erased from the official record of his life, leaving only these faint traces behind. The next morning, Margaret returned to the diner. The same woman was behind the counter, her expression as unreadable as before. Margaret ordered coffee and toast, and when the woman brought over, she did not leave. She stood there, her hands resting on the counter, her gaze fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. "You went out there," the woman said. It was not a question. Margaret nodded. "I did." The woman's mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. "And what did you find?" Margaret hesitated. She did not know this woman. She did not owe her answers. But there was something in the way she asked, something that suggested she already knew or at least suspected. "A foundation," Margaret said finally. "Old stone walls. And initials." MH and HH, the woman's expression shifted. A flicker of something passing across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or sorrow. She looked away, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Mary," she said softly. "Mary Holloway." Margaret's heart stuttered. Who was she? The woman sighed, a long, weary sound. Henry's first wife. The words landed like a blow. Margaret's hands went cold. Her vision narrowed. She had known Henry for 35 years. She had been married to him for 32. And in all that time, he had never once mentioned a first wife. Never once spoken the name Mary. The woman must have seen the shock on Margaret's face, because her expression softened, just slightly. "He didn't tell you," she said. It was not a question. "He never told anyone who came after." Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. "What happened to her?" The woman's gaze returned to Margaret, steady and unflinching. "She died. Out there on that land. They were building a house together, planning a life. And then one day, she just..." The woman paused, searching for the right word. "Disappeared. They found her weeks later. Some said it was an accident. Others weren't so sure." She let the words hang in the air, heavy and unresolved. "Henry left town after that. Never came back. Sold the land to his brother, who never did anything with it. And now it seems it's come back to you." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her, even though she was sitting perfectly still. Everything she thought she knew about Henry, about their life together, about the man she had married, was dissolving like mist. He had been married before. He had loved someone else. And that someone had died on the very land she now owned. She wanted to ask more, but the woman had already turned away, retreating into the kitchen as though the conversation had exhausted her. Margaret sat alone with her coffee, her mind reeling. She thought about the initials carved into the stone. She thought about Mary Holloway, a woman she had never known existed, whose life had ended in tragedy on a plot of land that now bore Margaret's name. And she thought about Henry, the man she had slept beside for 32 years, who had kept his secret buried so deep that it had taken his death to bring it to light. She spent the rest of the day at the library, a small, dusty building on the edge of town. The librarian, an elderly man with thick glasses and a kind smile, helped her navigate the archives. Yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, records that had been carefully preserved but rarely accessed. She found the articles easily enough. They were brief, clinical in their language, but the details were there. Mary Holloway, age 26, had gone missing in the autumn of 1973. She and her husband, Henry, had been building a house on land they had purchased together, planning to start a family. One evening, she had gone out to the property alone, saying she wanted to oversee some work. She never returned. Search parties combed the area for weeks. When they finally found her, she was at the bottom of a ravine on the property, her body broken, her death ruled an accidental fall. Henry had been questioned, of course. He had been the last person to see her alive, but there was no evidence of foul play, no motive, no reason to suspect him of anything other than tragic misfortune. The case was closed. Henry left town shortly after the funeral, and Mary Holloway became a footnote in the town's history, a story people mentioned in hushed tones before moving on to other things. Margaret read the articles 3 times, her hands shaking. She studied the photograph that accompanied one of them, a young woman with dark hair and a shy smile, standing beside a man Margaret recognized as a younger version of Henry. They looked happy. They looked like people who believed in the future. And yet, that future had ended on the very land Margaret now stood to inherit. She thought about Henry's silence, the way he had never once spoken to Mary, never once hinted at the life he had lived before her. She thought about the way he had always been distant, always holding something back, even in their most intimate moments. She had chalked it up to his personality, his reticence, his inability to express emotion. But now she understood. He had not been distant. He had been haunted, and he had spent 32 years ensuring that she never learned the truth. That night, Margaret returned to the land. She parked her car in the same spot as before and walked slowly across the property, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was cooler now, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain. She moved toward the foundation, the stone walls that stood as the only evidence of the house that had never been built. She knelt beside the initials and traced them once more, feeling the rough stone beneath her fingers. M.H. H.H. Mary and Henry. A promise carved in stone. A promise that had been broken. She stayed there for a long time, her knees pressed into the damp earth, her mind turning over everything she had learned. And then, slowly, she stood and walked toward the edge of the property, toward the ravine where Mary Holloway had died. The ground sloped sharply, dropping away into darkness. Margaret shone her light down into the depths, but she could see nothing, only shadows and a faint glimmer of water far below. She stood at the edge, her toes just inches from the drop, and felt the pull of gravity. The weight of the earth seemed to lean toward the void. It would be so easy, she thought, to step forward, to let go, to disappear the way Mary had. But she did not step forward. She stepped back, and as she did, she felt something shift inside her, a resolve, a determination, a refusal to let the story end the way Henry had intended. She would not disappear. She would not be forgotten. She would uncover the truth, whatever it was, and she would decide for herself what this land and this legacy meant. Margaret rented a small cabin on the outskirts of Millbrook, a place with a wood-burning stove and a porch that overlooked the forest. She told herself it was temporary, just until she figured out what to do with the land. But as the days turned into weeks, she found herself settling in, creating routines, learning the rhythms of this place that had once belonged to a woman she had never met. She spent her mornings at the library, poring over records, searching for anything that might shed light on Mary Holloway's death. She read police reports, coroner's notes, witness statements. She studied maps of the property, trying to understand the layout, the terrain, the places where someone might fall or be pushed. She found inconsistencies, small details that did not quite add up. A witness who claimed to have seen Mary walking toward the ravine, even though the sun had already set. A delay in reporting her missing. A full 24 hours between when Henry said she left and when he called the police. A lack of physical evidence at the scene, no signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no defensive wounds. Just a body at the bottom of a ravine, and a husband who could not explain why his wife had gone out there alone in the dark. She spoke to people in town, those who had been there in 1973, those who remembered the Holloways. Most were reluctant to talk, their answers vague and evasive, but a few opened up, their memories sharpened by time and distance. An old man at the hardware store told her that Henry had always been odd, that there was something cold about him, something that made people uneasy. A woman at the grocery store mentioned that Mary had seemed different in the weeks before her death, withdrawn, anxious, as though she were carrying a secret she could not share. And a retired sheriff's deputy, now in his 80s and living in a nursing home on the other side of the county, told Margaret something that chilled her to the bone. "I never believed it was an accident," he said, his voice thin but steady. "But we couldn't prove anything. Henry had an alibi. He was at a meeting in town when she disappeared. Witnesses confirmed it. But something didn't sit right. The way he talked about her after she died. Like she was already gone before she was gone, if you know what I mean. Like he had already moved on." Margaret asked him if he thought Henry had killed her. The old man looked at her for a long time before answering. "I think," he said slowly, "that some men are capable of things we can't imagine. And I think Henry Holloway was one of them." The word stayed with Margaret, echoing in her mind as she drove back to the cabin, as she lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, as she returned to the land day after day, searching for answers she was not sure she wanted to find. She began to explore the property more thoroughly, moving beyond the foundation, the ravine, venturing into the dense forest that bordered the land. She found remnants of old trails, overgrown but still faintly visible, leading deeper into the woods. She found a clearing where the grass was unnaturally flat, as though something heavy had been placed there and left to rot. And she found, half buried beneath a tangle of roots and leaves, a metal box. It was small, no larger than a shoebox, rusted and corroded but still intact. Margaret pulled it free, her hands trembling, and carried it back to the cabin. She set it on the table and stared at it for a long time before she finally pried it open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellow with age, tied together with a frayed ribbon. They were addressed to Mary, written in a hand Margaret recognized as Henry's. But these were not love letters. They were something else entirely. They were threats. Margaret read them one by one, her stomach twisting with each word. Henry's voice, which she had known as calm and measured, was venomous on the page. He accused Mary of betrayal, of lying, of conspiring against him. He wrote that she was trying to take the land, that she was planning to leave him, that she had turned his family against him. He wrote that she had made a mistake, that she did not understand what she was dealing with, that she would regret it. And in the final letter, dated just days before her death, he wrote, "If you think you can walk away from me from this, you are wrong. This land is mine. You are mine. and I will not let you destroy what I have built." Margaret's hand shook as she set the letter down. The words blurred before her eyes. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. This was not grief. This was not sorrow. This was rage. Henry had killed Mary. She was certain of it now. He had killed her and made it look like an accident, and he had walked away free, carrying his secret with him for the rest of his life. And then he had married Margaret, a woman who would never question him, who would never challenge him, who would accept the scraps he offered and ask for nothing more. She thought about the years she had spent with him, the quiet, empty years in a house that never felt like home. She thought about the way he had looked at her, or rather, the way he had looked through her, as though she were a placeholder, a shadow of someone else. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like a punch to the chest, that she had never been his wife. She had been his penance, his way of burying the past, his proof to the world that he had moved on, that he was a good man, that he was not a murderer. She had been a lie he told himself for 32 years. And now he was gone, and the lie had crumbled, and all that was left was a truth buried beneath the earth and waiting to be unearthed. Margaret did not sleep that night. She sat on the porch of the cabin, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars roll slowly across the sky. She thought about Mary Holloway, a woman who had been erased from history, whose story had been buried along with her body. She thought about the letters, the evidence of Henry's cruelty, the proof that he had been capable of unspeakable things. And she thought about what to do next. She could go to the police, show them the letters, reopen the case. But it had been 50 years. Henry was dead. There would be no justice, no trial, no accountability. The only thing that would happen is that Mary's name would be dragged to the mud again, her story reduced to a cold case file that would gather dust in some archive. Or she could keep the letters. She could carry the truth with her, hold it close, let it reshape the way she understood her own life. She could honor Mary by refusing to let her be forgotten, by telling her story, by ensuring that the land they both inherited will become something more than a grave. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Margaret made her decision. She would not let Henry's legacy stand unchallenged. She would not let his family profit from the land that had been built on Mary's death. She would claim it, not as an inheritance, but as a reckoning. She would build something here, something that would stand as a testament to the woman who had been lost, the woman who had been silenced. She did not know yet what it would be, a garden, a memorial, a refuge, but it would be hers, and it would be Mary's, and it would be a place where the truth could finally breathe. Margaret began the work of transformation slowly, carefully, as though she were excavating something fragile and ancient. She cleared the overgrowth from the foundation, pulling away vines and weeds until the stone walls stood bare and exposed. She repaired what she could, replacing crumbling mortar, shoring up weak points, honoring the structure that Mary and Henry had begun but never finished. She planted wildflowers along the edges of property, species native to the region, chosen for their resilience and their beauty. She installed a bench near the ravine, a place to sit and remember, a place to mourn. And at the center of it all, on the highest point of the land, she erected a simple stone marker with Mary Holloway's name carved into it, along with the dates of her birth and death. It was not a grave. Mary was buried in the town cemetery, her headstone weathered and forgotten, but it was a monument, a declaration that she had existed, that she had mattered, that she would not be erased. The townspeople watched Margaret's work with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Some thought she was eccentric, a widow with too much time and too much grief. Others thought she was brave, reclaiming a piece of history that had been lost. And a few, those who remembered Mary, who had known her and mourned her, thought she was doing something sacred. They came to the land, one by one, bringing flowers and stories, sharing memories that had been locked away for decades. They told Margaret about Mary's kindness, her laughter, her dreams of building a home and starting a family. They told her about the day she disappeared, the way the town had held its breath, hoping for a miracle that never came. And they told her in hushed voices that they had always suspected Henry, but had never dared to say it aloud. Margaret listened to them all. She absorbed their stories, wove them into the fabric of the land, let them become part of the soil and the stone. And she began to understand that this place was not just Mary's legacy. It was hers too. It was a place where women who had been silenced could speak, where women who had been erased could be remembered, where women who had been broken could be made whole. As the months passed, the land began to change. The wildflowers bloomed in riots of color, purple lupins and golden poppies, white daisies and crimson clover. Birds returned, nesting in the trees, filling the air with song. Deer wandered the clearings at dawn and dusk, their eyes dark and watchful. And people came. Not many, but enough. They came to see what Margaret had built, to pay their respects to Mary, to find solace in a place that had once been a site of tragedy but was now something else, a sanctuary, a refuge, a testament to survival. Margaret did not charge admission. She did not advertise. She simply opened the gate and let people in, trusting that those who needed to find it would. And they did. Women, mostly, though not exclusively. Women who had lost husbands, partners, parents. Women who had been betrayed, abandoned, erased. Women who needed a place to grieve, to rage, to begin again. They walked the trails Margaret had carved through the forest. They sat on the bench by the ravine and stared into the depths. They touched Mary's marker and whispered their own names, their own stories, their own truths. And they left, changed in ways they could not always articulate, but could always feel. Margaret herself changed too. The woman who had arrived in Millbrook months ago, broken and uncertain, began to harden and sharpen, like steel tempered in fire. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. She stopped shrinking herself to fit into the narrow confines of other people's expectations. She learned to speak with authority, to make decisions without second-guessing herself, to trust her instincts even when they led her into unfamiliar territory. She cut her hair short. She wore clothes that made her feel strong rather than invisible. She stood taller, walked with purpose, looked people in the eye when she spoke. And she discovered, to her surprise, that she was not alone. There were others like her, women who had been left behind, discarded, deemed worthless by the men who had once claimed to love them. And together, they were building something new. Not a movement, not an organization, but a quiet, steady current of change, flowing beneath the surface, reshaping the landscape one small act of defiance at a time. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned the color of bruises, Margaret stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down. She thought about Mary, falling to the darkness, alone and afraid. She thought about Henry, standing somewhere above, watching, waiting, letting her die. And she thought about herself, standing here now, alive and unbowed, refusing to let that story be the end. She knelt and placed her hand flat against the ground, feeling the earth pulse beneath her palm. And she made a promise, not to Mary, but to herself. She would not be forgotten. She would not be erased. She would take everything Henry had tried to bury, the secrets, the lies, the cruelty, and she would turn it into something that mattered. She would make this land sacred, not in the way churches were sacred with rules and rituals and hierarchies, but in the way wildflowers were sacred in rain and the first light of dawn breaking over the mountains. Sacred because it was alive. Sacred because it refused to die. And as she stood and turned to walk back toward the cabin, she felt something she had not felt in years, perhaps ever. She felt free, not because the past had been erased, but because she had finally stopped running from it. Not because Henry's sins had been forgiven, but because she had decided they no longer defined her. She was Margaret Holloway, widow, inheritor, survivor, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. Margaret returned to the motel that night with more questions than answers. She lay in the narrow bed, her mind racing, replaying the moment she had seen those initials carved into the stone. M.H. and H.H. She had never known Henry to be sentimental. He had not been the kind of man to carve declarations into trees or write love letters. He had been practical, methodical, a man who measured his life in spreadsheets and schedules. And yet, there was evidence of something she had not known, a piece of his past that had been hidden from her. Or perhaps, she thought with a pang of something that felt like grief, a piece of himself he had tried to forget. She wondered when he had been there. She wondered who he had been with. The initials could have been hers, but she knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that they were not. M.H. was someone else. Someone who had stood on that land with Henry and carved a promise into stone. Someone who had been erased from the official record of his life, leaving only these faint traces behind. The next morning, Margaret returned to the diner. The same woman was behind the counter, her expression as unreadable as before. Margaret ordered coffee and toast, and when the woman brought it over, she did not leave. She stood there, her hands resting on the counter, her gaze fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. "You went out there," the woman said. It was not a question. Margaret nodded. "I did." The woman's mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. "And what did you find?" Margaret hesitated. She did not know this woman. She did not owe her answers. But there was something in the way she asked, something that suggested she already knew, or at least suspected. "A foundation," Margaret said finally. "Old stone walls. And initials. M.H. and H.H. The woman's expression shifted, a flicker of something passing across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or sorrow. She looked away, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Mary," she said softly. "Mary Holloway." Margaret's heart stuttered. Who was she? The woman sighed, a long, weary sound. Henry's first wife. The words landed like a blow. Margaret's hands went cold. Her vision narrowed. She had known Henry for 35 years. She had been married to him for 32. And in all that time, he had never once mentioned a first wife, never once spoken the name Mary. The woman must have seen the shock on Margaret's face, because her expression softened just slightly. "He didn't tell you," she said. It was not a question. "He never told anyone who came after." Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. "What happened to her?" The woman's gaze returned to Margaret, steady and unflinching. "She died, out there on that land. They were building a house together, planning a life. And then one day, she just..." The woman paused, searching for the right word. "Disappeared. They found her weeks later. Some said it was an accident. Others weren't so sure." She let the words hang in the air, heavy and unresolved. "Henry left town after that. Never came back. Sold the land to his brother, who never did anything with it. And now it seems it's come back to you." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her, even though she was sitting perfectly still. Everything she thought she knew about Henry, about their life together, about the man she had married, was dissolving like mist. He had been married before. He had loved someone else. And that someone had died on the very land she now owned. She wanted to ask more, but the woman had already turned away, retreating into the kitchen as though the conversation had exhausted her. Margaret sat alone with her coffee, her mind reeling. She thought about the initials carved into the stone. She thought about Mary Holloway, a woman she had never known existed, whose life had ended in tragedy on a plot of land that now bore Margaret's name. And she thought about Henry, the man she had slept beside for 32 years, who had kept this secret buried so deep that it had taken his death to bring it to light. She spent the rest of the day at the library, a small, dusty building on the edge of town. The librarian, an elderly man with thick glasses and a kind smile, helped her navigate the archives, yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, records that had been carefully preserved but rarely accessed. She found the articles easily enough. They were brief, clinical in their language, but the details were there. Mary Holloway, age 26, had gone missing in the autumn of 1973. She and her husband, Henry, had been building a house on land they had purchased together, planning to start a family. One evening, she had gone out to the property alone, saying she wanted to oversee some work. She never returned. Search parties combed the area for weeks. When they finally found her, she was at the bottom of a ravine on the property, her body broken, her death ruled an accidental fall. Henry had been questioned, of course. He had been the last person to see her alive. But there was no evidence of foul play, no motive, no reason to suspect him of anything other than tragic misfortune. The case was closed. Henry left town shortly after the funeral, and Mary Holloway became a footnote in the town's history, a story people mentioned in hushed tones before moving on to other things. Her heart pounded as she pulled it open. Below was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. She hesitated, fear warring with curiosity, but only for a moment. Then she climbed down. The space below was a cellar, damp and cold, the walls lined with stone. And there, in the center of the room, was a trunk. Margaret opened it with shaking hands. Inside were more letters, but not from Henry. These were from Mary. They were addressed to her sister, never sent, chronicling the slow unraveling of her marriage. Mary wrote about Henry's jealousy, his controlling behavior, his insistence that she belonged to him and no one else. She wrote about his threats, his refusal to let her leave, his promise that if she tried, he would make sure no one ever found her. And in the final letter, written the day before she died, Mary wrote, "I am leaving tonight. I have hidden this trunk here, where he will never find it. If something happens to me, I want someone to know the truth. I want someone to know that I tried." Margaret sat in the darkness, tears streaming down her face, the letters clutched in her hands. Mary had known. She had known Henry was dangerous, and she had tried to escape, and she had left behind evidence, a trail of breadcrumbs for someone to follow, for Margaret to follow. This was not just a story of loss. It was a story of resistance. Mary Holloway had not gone quietly. She had fought, even in her final moments, to ensure her voice would not be silenced. And now, 50 years later, Margaret had found it. She climbed back up into the daylight, the letters pressed against her chest, and she made a decision. She would not hide these letters. She would not keep them secret. She would give them to the authorities, reopen the investigation, force the world to see what Henry had done. Not for justice. It was too late for that. But for truth. For Mary. And for every woman who had ever been erased, forgotten, silenced. This land was not just an inheritance. It was a reckoning. The investigation was reopened. The letters were submitted as evidence. Henry Holloway's name, once spoken with respect, became synonymous with cruelty and deceit. His family distanced themselves, claiming ignorance, refusing to acknowledge their complicity in his cover-up. The town of Millbrook, which had buried Mary's story for half a century, was forced to confront its own silence. And Margaret, the woman who had been given nothing but a worthless plot of land, became the keeper of a story that refused to die. She did not leave Millbrook. She stayed, tending the land, welcoming those who came to remember, to grieve, to heal. The foundation became a gathering place, a sanctuary for women who needed to be heard. And Mary Holloway's name, once forgotten, was spoken again, not as a victim, but as a woman who had fought to the end. Margaret learned to live with the ghosts. She learned that the past does not disappear simply because we refuse to look at it. It waits. It lingers. It demands acknowledgement. And when we finally turn to face it, we discover that it has been shaping us all along. She thought often of Henry, the man she had believed she knew, the man who had hidden so much beneath a mask of normalcy. She did not forgive him, but she understood, in a way she had not before, that he had been afraid of being seen, afraid of being known, afraid of the truth. And in his fear, he had destroyed 2 lives, Mary's and his own. Margaret would not make the same mistake. She would not hide. She would not erase herself to make others comfortable. She would stand in the light, however harsh, and let herself be seen. The land thrived. The flowers bloomed each spring, brighter and more abundant than the year before. The trails deepened, worn smooth by the feet of those who walked them. The bench by the ravine became a place of pilgrimage, carved with names and messages left by visitors who had found solace there. And the stone marker bearing Mary's name stood tall, unyielding, a monument to the refusal to be forgotten. Margaret grew old on that land. Her hair turned white, her hands gnarled and strong from years of work. But she did not grow weary. She woke each morning with purpose, with clarity, with the knowledge that she was doing something that mattered. She was giving voice to the voiceless. She was creating space for grief, for rage, for transformation. She was building a legacy not of wealth or power, but of truth. And when, many years later, Margaret Holloway finally closed her eyes for the last time, it was not in a sterile hospital room or a lonely house. It was on the land beneath the open sky, surrounded by wildflowers and bird song and the quiet rustle of leaves. She died the way she had learned to live, unafraid, unbowed, and utterly free. The land was donated to a trust in her name, ensuring it will remain a sanctuary forever. And on her gravestone, beside Mary Holloway's marker, were carved only 3 words. She found herself. The wind still moves through the trees on that land. The flowers still bloom. The stories still echo. And those who come there, searching for something they cannot name, find it waiting, not in answers, but in the quiet, persistent truth that even in the darkest places, even in the deepest silence, something can still grow, something can still rise, something can still be reborn.